I'm Steve Morgan, founder of Cybersecurity Ventures and editor-in-chief at Cybercrime Magazine, and we're hacking in the Hamptons. I'm here with our fourth panel consisting of Alashe, founder and CEO at CybSafe, developers of a leading human risk management platform, and Keith Stewart, founder and CEO of a stealth startup focused on protecting the human layer of security from generative AI-powered attackers. Hacking in the Hamptons is brought to you by Evolution Equity Partners, an international venture capital investor partnering with exceptional entrepreneurs to develop market-leading cybersecurity and enterprise software companies. To learn more about Evolution Equity Partners, visit evolutionequity.com. Oz, welcome. Great to have you back on with us.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks for having me back.
Keith, first time with us. Looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Oz, you've been in this industry a long time. I can't believe that the word phishing is going to come up today, that, we're still talking about this, but we have some bigger picture things to talk about, although the phishing threat remains. I want to ask you to kick off, Oz, about the 2024 Forrester Wave for the human risk management market. And I want to point out, we're looking at upwards of $10 billion by 2027. And according to Gartner, this was about $1 billion market 10, 12 years ago. So this is really, really growing. And obviously, we're trying to tackle a big problem. But I do want to ask you, Oz, Forrester renamed their tracking of this space from security awareness training to human risk management. So what's the difference between the two terms? And that's a pretty big deal for them to reclassify the tracking of an entire market. Why did they do that?
Steve, it's a great question, and it's actually one that I think quite a few people and quite a lot of security leaders and security and risk leaders are thinking about right now, which is, what does the shift actually mean, and what does it mean for them as organizations? It really recognizes something that has been happening for quite some time. No matter what we invest and have invested over the years, and we really are talking about a couple of decades now of investment into real thinking around security awareness training, simulated phishing as well, we're not seeing the corresponding reduction in human risk. Human risk management looks at this from a risk perspective, which says, what is the likelihood that something's going to happen, and what's the impact if it does? And then where is the data that suggests that if we do this, apply this intervention, we're going to reduce that risk? Human risk management really focuses on effective interventions and effective outcomes, or the outcomes that we would wish to see. And it does that by focusing on security behaviors. Training hopes to change behavior, or less than 15% of people actually change their behavior sustainably on the basis of the training they receive. No matter how much they like it, no matter how much they laugh, no matter how much they engage, they don't actually necessarily change their behavior. If you're not changing behavior, you're not reducing risk. Human risk management addresses that.
So, Keith, I guess none of this would matter unless, we were able to, meaning the bad guys, the hackers, the cyber criminals, were able to bypass or leverage the human, social engineering attacks, phishing attacks, what have you. There was a statistic that Forrester had in their report, but I've read this in many other media outlets from numerous other sources. They say about 90% of data breaches will include the human element in 2024. That's a staggering statistic. Are they right? Is that an accurate figure? What's your take?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes to the point that Oz was just making, which is human behaviors are pervasive in how we think about cyber, how we think about our protective profiles. But classically, we tend to avoid directly working on that as an attack surface. Now, the numbers get quite high because you've got a duality issue here with people. I've got external attackers that are coming in and trying to attack my people. I've got internal trusted folks who have insider access to things that can misuse that. And increasingly with generative AI, it makes it very hard to tell the difference between those two categories of people. When you pull it down, there's sort of two primary core issues at play in human vulnerability. Number one, people need privileges to do their job. They just do. And if I'm a mid-level accountant, I have a surprising degree of privilege. Privilege reduction technologies are not going to change that, because your people need to have access to systems to do their job. The second issue, and Oz basically pointed this out, we can't patch people. Our cyber programs are much more comfortable with, I've got a vulnerability, let me patch it. Maybe that's in my applications, maybe that's in my infrastructure, but we know how to run that playbook. Neither one of those work here. And it is, to your point, a big deal. You cite the 90% statistic. I think that's important and drives the point home. But I'd go back to the MGM Resorts breach. 100 million loss event. And the pivot point in the breach, the point at which the attackers had their runaway success, was an impersonation call into a help desk where they got somebody's credentials given to them. And after that, they were off to the races.
Amazing. And you would think that the help desk would be critical, and that those employees would not only be trained, but, tested, examined, and, confirmed that, they're aware of those types of attacks.
And yet most organizations have no vulnerability, no visibility to even see such a thing as taking place.
And that's the key that Keith has just made there, that they don't have the visibility into said vulnerability. It's not that people aren't trained often, or not that people don't know what to do often. There are doctors who smoke. So when you internalize that fact, and then you realize that what we do is not necessarily directly correlated to how much we know, when you actually understand that, then you will start to ask yourself a question, which is, as a security community, why do we think that security awareness training is going to reduce all our human risk? And even though that pivot point, as Keith described, was an individual at the help center, I would suggest that actually, of course, that's just one part of the system. There are lots of things that have gone wrong for that incident to have got to where it got to, and people are part of the system. And so human risk management really acknowledges that. It says, actually, if this is a genuine risk that we care about, we've got to be more intelligent about how we address it. Training on its own, phishing simulations on their own, they're not going to make the difference. They're not going to reduce things. You're just going to reduce your click rate and increase your report rate and still have incidents.
Oz, I actually saw a doctor once who was smoking, and he told me I needed an operation on my foot. No joke. I had injured it running. Good thing I didn't listen to him. It healed on its own, and it was the last time that I saw him. Fortunately, I haven't seen another doctor smoking. On a more serious note, though, I read something, Oz, in the Harvard Business Review, and I almost wasn't going to bring this up today because, sometimes you don't want to go to such a dark place, yet we need to, because we have to be prepared. It's really critical. We have discussed this offline with some CISOs. So in the Harvard Business Review, they wrote that they expect AI to drastically increase the quantity and quality of phishing scams. Now, I can't possibly imagine, looking at where we have been, where we are today, that it could potentially get worse. How big of a problem is this? Are CISOs and security leaders right to be worried?
They are right to be concerned or to be aware. Whether they should be worried, it really depends on their approach to addressing this type of risk. What do I mean by that? If you think about it, most organizations introduce, without meaning to, without knowing, additional human risk almost on a quarterly basis. Every intervention or every digital transformation program they run, introducing new software, AI adoption, cloud adoption, these are all asking people to use technologies in new ways. And with that, effectively becomes the opportunity for those things to be manipulated for a period of time. So AI is no different on that front. And if I was to pick one thing to focus on with AI, then phishing might be an obvious thing to pick, because ultimately the way particularly generative AI today, but AI in general, is being used, actually content and the increase of content, the ease with which content can be produced, the ease with which content can be personalized is something we're seeing being used to good effect. Why would the criminals not use it to bad effect? And we are already starting to see that happen, an increase in certain types of phishing scams being done effectively at scale using AI. But is it something to be worried about? Well, if you think about it, that's just an increase in scale. It's not actually an increase or change in what they're actually doing. They're just basically making it easy to do the same thing at scale. And therefore, I would suggest that actually we already have many of the tools at our disposal to address this. Phishing behaviors are about more than click rates and report rates. The reason they're able to personalize is because people are sharing too much information on social media. Let's address that behavior. Or the reason people are able to get those emails just in the first place is because people are reusing their work credentials in places they shouldn't be. Let's address that behavior. There are so many other behaviors we could address for phishing if phishing was the thing we're important about. Let's be clear about the behaviors that matter.
So Keith, you're an expert in the area of generative AI, very impressive background. What's your take on what Harvard Business Review wrote? And they're not the only place where we've heard this from, but are phishing attacks going to intensify, be more sophisticated due to AI? And do you think we'll see new types of security companies, new market entrants as a result of that?
I think undoubtedly on both of those, right? Generative AI makes weak attackers strong, and it makes strong attackers scale. While much of the underlying infrastructure that we're worried about here, our people, our human capital, remains the same, and their vulnerabilities and behaviors remain the same, to Oz's point, the scale of what we're looking at and what's coming at us right now is so large as to require a bit of a stair-step change in how we think about it. If you think about it from an attacker's perspective, attacks are largely financially motivated, right? I need a set of requirements in order to do something sophisticated to attack a person. I typically need three things. One, I need reconnaissance on that individual so I can create convincing lures for them. Two, I need the right language skills in order to communicate with that person in such a way where I can manipulate, or impersonate, or come close to them. And three, I need persistence. I need a savviness and persistence in my communications. So spear phishing attacks are an excellent example of this classically. All three of those things are in place. We don't see large volumes of spear phishing attacks because having those three things is expensive, right? And so you tend to only do those classically on your highest value targets. Generative AI makes all three of those things radically cheaper. You can now be a young kid somewhere in Kazakhstan and sound like a middle-aged Welshman. It is a very, very different world when all that stuff is a prompt away. So the degree of sophistication, the broad base of employees who get attacked by that, I think is fundamentally a different risk profile than we faced before. Now, the good news on all of this is that classically our instrumentation was quite narrow. We focused on email as the channel in which we would communicate with people, and we tend to put a lot of attention onto our own internal employees. Supply chain vulnerabilities have taught us we got to be much broader at how we look at the world, which means we need a lot more signal, we need a lot more analysis of that signal. Good news, the same thing that changed the economics for bad guys can change economics for defenders. We can go pull different kinds of signal into our security program and leverage AI and large language models to pull out of that the information that we need. And the phone calls that are going into help desks that are manipulating individuals are security attacks, just like any other. We need to treat them the same way. We need detective controls in place around those. We need response plans in place around those. That's how we defend against this stair-step increase in change caused by attackers using generative AI.
So, Oz, you've always been forward-looking. As a result, CybSafe is you're one step ahead, which is great, and we look to you as one of the sources in our industry. So, you've been talking about security culture for a while. CISOs, security leaders, and this isn't to point the finger at them, they have an incredibly difficult job to do. I'd say it's probably been this past year where that's really surfaced as a strategic discussion. Prior to that, really, it was security awareness training. Not that there's anything wrong with phishing simulation and things that we've been doing for the past decade, but you talk to a lot of CISOs. Are they thinking more about culture? Is that, a big picture for them today compared to, a few years ago?
Absolutely, Steve. They are. They're not just thinking about security culture, but actually the security leaders and CISOs that we're speaking to are thinking about what does that actually mean in my organization? For quite some time, we've been talking about security culture as a community, but the reality is we've been quite vague about it. In essence, security awareness will improve our security culture, or we would like to improve our security culture. But the question is, what actually are we talking about? And what is emerging is real clarity around security culture being the values, the attitudes, and the beliefs that shape the behaviors and how things are done in your organization. So if that's what you're looking to influence, the values, the attitudes, and beliefs that shape the behaviors, remember what I said earlier on about if you're not influencing behavior, you're not reducing risk. And ultimately, if you can shape the values and attitudes and beliefs, and there's lots of different things that need to be done to that, or where we can be much more specific. So it's really interesting because you're right. The industry has been talking about culture for some time. Now we're getting to brass tacks. What is the data I can use to help me understand the values, attitudes, and beliefs? What is the data I can use to help me understand the behaviors? Are my behaviors moving? Are they moving in the right direction? If not, what can I do? How do I automate that? And how do I compensate for it? Because of course, if I can measure my behavior, I don't need to rely on a human being doing X, Y, or Z. Maybe I change A, B, C somewhere else. Maybe I change the infrastructure. Maybe I change their access. Maybe I change the environment. That is how we address the risk properly. And security culture sits smack bang in the middle of that.
So Keith, earlier you mentioned the MGM cyber attack. Yes, they're unique in some respects, and you look at the help desk in that situation, but we've tracked a lot of these, large data breaches, cyber attacks, and social engineering oftentimes is where it originates. So we have Fortune 500 CISOs, Global 2000 CISOs, and security leaders. That's our primary audience. They're watching us. What's your message to them strategically? What should they be doing? What can they be doing that they haven't already been doing to build more awareness and culture in their organization?
But I think working on a culture of security is important. It's also very hard. CISOs have mixed levels of partnership with their peers in other parts of the business. Fostering those can be a really good thing to do. And so all of that, I 100% agree with. The other side of that is that we have to recognize that what we're talking about here is an attack surface. It's a bit strange. We've at times been uncomfortable with dealing with that because these are our employees, these are contractors, these are people that we brought into the organization, but they're an attack surface like any other. The good news in my mind is once we make that statement out loud, it allows us to bring a whole set of machinery that we know how to do when we've identified attack surface. I need to inventory the people, not just the accounts, not just the devices, but the people. I need to understand where those attack surfaces are exposed to the outside world. That means more than email. Where do I have people who are using public Discord channels to talk about the company? Where do I have help desk calls that are coming in? What kind of visibility and detective controls do I have in place on that? These are sort of the classic tools that we know how to use. We have to apply them on this layer. One of the places where I found folks who are perhaps a little bit more in that overwhelmed piece that you were talking about there, Steve, work with your outside pen testers, work with your red teams. They are often quite good at calibrating your organization's security maturity and dialing into that. Where are the places of largest vulnerability in your human attack surface? That can allow you to much more pragmatically tie projects to try and reduce that risk.
So Oz, I'm looking at our data breach log here. There's 15,000 auto dealerships down across the US and Canada as a result of a ransomware attack. And you'd like to be thinking about something else, but as a CEO, and I'm sure the CISO and the security team there, they're all collaborating and talking about paying a ransom. And talk to us about ransomware. Teresa Payton, former CIO at the White House, was on CNBC today. She called it the summer of ransomware because we've seen so many attacks lately. And of course, these are oftentimes tied back to phishing attacks.
Ransomware is the scourge that won't go away. In fact, in fairness, I suspect we'll see it go the other way, which is to increase somewhat. Why? Because as Keith said so eloquently earlier on, ultimately, many of these things are financially motivated. And there is nothing easier than getting access to somebody's system and simply threatening them with the thing that they want to happen the least. This is just happening so commonly and so frequently with so many organizations, and it's hard. As you have alluded to, often the infected malware is actually triggered by somebody clicking on a link that they shouldn't have clicked. But I would really encourage us to be really clear. The whole thing is a system. And the fact that somebody clicks on a link and that leads to a ransomware attack, that is not the reason the ransomware attack happened. That is just one step in a process of things that have not gone right, and therefore there's much work to be done. We feel our hearts go out, and indeed, of course, our sympathies go out to many of the organizations all around the globe, across the US, who are dealing with this right now, and unfortunately many more will deal with a similar thing. We have to take the human aspect of this challenge much more seriously, and I can't be clearer. If we're not changing the behaviors of our people, then we're not making any difference. Doesn't matter how much training you're giving them, how much work you're doing. So how do we do that? That's the real question. And then how do we measure to see whether it's happening? Because that's how we assure ourselves that risk reduction is occurring.
So to ask you as a citizen, Oz, because you're based in London, how does it feel? How hard is it to watch the hospitals there locally and what they're dealing with and the patients and the families as a result of that?
I split my time between London and Boston, actually traditionally almost 50-50 at the moment. And so quite literally in both the UK and in the US, I'm watching very similar things play out. And it's tough. It's tough to see, as a security community, we're very used to criminals disrupting operations and activities and attempting to extort money in a way that's frustrating, illegal, unacceptable, but ultimately relatively harmless, or at least the harm is about doing things to people that is disruptive and absolutely wrong, but ultimately not a loss to life. When it's an attack on health systems, it is effectively a direct attack that could lead to loss of life. And that's effectively what we're seeing. And so the recent attack on the UK NHS that is really ongoing as we speak now, as we've just discussed, and indeed actually on others in the US as well, other health systems, these things matter. And actually, you could go one stage further, attacks on other critical national infrastructure and utilities. These things really matter. And interestingly, the one positive out of it, or a positive out of it, is it does also catch the attention of people who maybe would overlook some of these security challenges. But as we've heard all along, these are going to increase. Generative AI is going to make these things more likely to happen. And as defenders, we need to understand and we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared.
So Keith, maybe to close out on a positive note, Gen AI, what does that bring to the table for cybercrime fighters, for white hats, for the good guys, if you will? And is that going to ultimately help them level up or even get ahead of the criminals?
I absolutely think it will. I think, unfortunately, the bad guys are often more motivated than we are, or certainly some of our peers are in the community at moving quick. And so I think it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. I'm here in California, and we tend to talk a lot about venture capital and the amount of money that's going into the defender side in the venture capital world. It's important to recognize that all these ransoms are capital flowing into the bad guy economy. They are full of money that they can go and use in order to power the next stage of attacks. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. However, to your silver lining point, I do think that organizations fundamentally have some asymmetry against the bad guys that'll play out as we use generative AI. Organizations know themselves, they know their people, they know their business better than any outsider. Now, that information is diffuse across the organization, but generative AI gives us the opportunity to pull that together, to sift through the noise and pull out the signals about what makes our people themselves, what makes our company what it is. And so then to fight against people who are trying to deceive or manipulate or impersonate, we have the knowledge we need to do that. We just need tooling to bring that together in a real-time actionable sense so that we can fight these guys off. And so I think that is going to happen. I think we'll see substantial labor efficiency improvements that come with generative AI. Our SOC teams are going to get better. I think our tooling is going to get better. The one other thing I would say that I think we're remiss not to say this out loud in this time of transition, I would be very careful about signing long-term contracts with existing suppliers right now. I think there will be a stair-step change in technology underpinning our cyber products that exist right now. And so maybe the next crop of Gen AI-powered tools aren't going to be as mature as a given CISO needs for their immediate needs. But man, I would not be signing a 3 or a 5 year long contract unless I had conviction that my supplier was going to be best in class at AI-based threat defense.
Well, we're going to leave it there. We appreciate the positive outlook. I think there is one there. There is a silver lining, Keith. And thank you so much for coming on with us the first time, and hope to have you back on with us again soon.
It was great to be here.
Oz, as always, great to have you, and you'll be back on with us. You're already scheduled, looking forward to it, and your thought leadership is always appreciated by the CISOs who are tuned in.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Really great to join this chat.
I'm Steve Morgan, founder of Cybersecurity Ventures and editor-in-chief at Cybercrime Magazine. Hacking in the Hamptons is brought to you by Evolution Equity, an international venture capital investor partnering with exceptional entrepreneurs to develop market-leading cybersecurity and enterprise software companies. Visit evolutionequity.com to learn more. You can keep up with all of our media at cybercrimemagazine.com.